I was sitting in my favorite leather recliner on that Tuesday afternoon when Brad walked into my living room without knocking. Something felt different about him immediately. His usual fake smile was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating expression I had never seen before. He carried a manila folder thick with documents and spread them across my coffee table like he owned the place. "Denver, we need to talk," he said, his voice lacking any warmth or respect. "It's time you signed the house over to Sarah and me. You can't handle this responsibility anymore." He pushed the papers toward me with shocking arrogance, as if I had no choice in the matter. But when I calmly reached for my desk drawer, his smug confidence vanished in seconds. The change in Brad's demeanor was so stark it left me momentarily speechless. This was not the charming young man who had swept my daughter Sarah off her feet 3 years ago. This was someone I barely recognized, someone whose mask had finally slipped to reveal what lay beneath. "Look, Denver," Brad continued, settling into the couch across from me with the casual authority of someone who believed he held all the cards. "We both know you've been having problems lately. Memory issues, confusion, difficulty managing basic tasks. Sarah and I have been discussing this for months." I felt a chill run down my spine. Memory issues? Confusion? What was he talking about? I was 72 years old, but my mind was as sharp as it had ever been. I maintained my own books, managed my investments, and could still beat my neighbor Jim at chess 3 games out of 4. Brad reached into his folder and pulled out a stack of photographs. "These were taken last month," he said, spreading them across the table. They showed my front yard with overgrown grass, my mailbox tilted at an odd angle, and what appeared to be newspapers scattered on my porch. "You're clearly struggling to maintain basic property upkeep." I stared at the images in disbelief. My lawn was immaculate. I mowed it every Saturday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, just as I had for the past 15 years. My mailbox stood perfectly straight, and I never let mail accumulate. These photographs had been doctored or staged somehow. And then there are the medical concerns, Brad continued, producing what appeared to be consultation notes from a doctor I had never heard of. "Dr. Williams documented several instances of disorientation and memory lapses during your recent visits." "I've never seen a Dr. Williams in my life," I said firmly. Brad's expression didn't change. "That's exactly what Dr. Williams said you would say. Classic denial behavior associated with early-stage cognitive decline." The sophistication of his manipulation was breathtaking. He had an answer for everything, a counter to every protest I might make. I realized this conversation had been planned and rehearsed down to the smallest detail. "Sarah is heartbroken about this," Brad said, his voice taking on a tone of false sympathy. "She loves you so much, but she's terrified you're going to hurt yourself or someone else. Just last week, you left the stove on for hours. The week before, you forgot to lock your front door and left it wide open all night. None of this had happened. My memory was excellent, my daily routines unchanged from decades of habit. But as Brad spoke, I began to remember recent family dinners at their house, where I had felt unusually foggy and disoriented afterward. I had attributed it to fatigue or perhaps a mild cold, but now a darker possibility began to form in my mind. "The lawyers I've consulted say we have more than enough documentation to pursue legal guardianship," Brad said, his tone becoming more threatening. "But Sarah doesn't want to put you through that humiliation. She'd rather handle this privately, as a family." The threat was clear. Sign over my property willingly, or they would take it through the courts. I had to admire the cruel elegance of the trap he had constructed. Even if I protested my mental competence, he could claim that as evidence of my confusion and denial. Brad leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I've been recording our conversations, Denver. Every confused rambling, every repetitive question, every moment of obvious disorientation. The court will hear exactly what Sarah and I have been dealing with." Recording our conversations, I felt a surge of anger at this violation of my privacy and trust, but I forced myself to remain calm. If Brad thought he was dealing with a confused old man, I would let him continue believing that for now. "Where did you get the money for that watch?" I asked suddenly, noticing the expensive Rolex gleaming on his wrist. "And those shoes? That suit? Sarah works part-time at the library, and you've been unemployed for 6 months." For just a moment, Brad's confident mask slipped, and I saw something ugly flash across his features. Sarah's been helping me with some business investments, he said quickly. Nothing you need to worry about. But I was worrying. I was worrying very much. Because in that brief moment, when his guard was down, I had seen the real Brad, not the loving husband and caring son-in-law he pretended to be, but someone cold and calculating and completely without conscience. The paperwork is straightforward, Brad said, recovering his composure and returning to his prepared script. A simple transfer of deed. Sarah and I will take care of everything from here on out. You won't have to worry about maintenance, property taxes, insurance, any of it. And where exactly would I live? I asked. There's a lovely assisted living facility called Sunset Manor, about 20 minutes from here. We've already spoken with them. They have an opening in their memory care unit. Memory care unit. The words hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't just planning to steal my house. He was planning to have me committed to a facility for people with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. People who couldn't make decisions for themselves or manage their own affairs. This is all happening very fast, I said carefully. Perhaps we should wait for Sarah to get home from work so we can discuss it as a family. Brad's smile returned, but it was razor thin and predatory. Sarah's already here. Denver. She's in the car, working up the courage to come inside. She knows this is going to be difficult for you. My heart sank. My beloved daughter, the little girl I had raised alone after her mother died, was sitting in the driveway, preparing to help this man steal everything I owned and destroy what remained of my independence and dignity. Why don't you call her in? I suggested. I'd like to hear what she has to say about all this. Brad pulled out his phone and sent a quick text. Within minutes, I heard footsteps on my front porch and the familiar sound of Sarah's key in the lock. She entered looking pale and nervous, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she had been crying. But as I looked at my daughter, I realized something that gave me the first glimmer of hope I had felt since this nightmare began. In my desk drawer, just inches from my right hand, lay evidence that could destroy Brad's carefully constructed lies and expose him for exactly what he really was. I just had to decide whether I was ready to reveal what I knew. Sarah stood in the doorway looking like she would rather be anywhere else on earth. Her usual bright demeanor was replaced by an expression of forced determination that broke my heart. This was not the confident, independent woman I had raised, but someone who looked beaten down and manipulated. "Hi, Dad," she said softly, not quite meeting my eyes as she took a seat next to Brad on the couch. "Hello, sweetheart," I replied, studying her face carefully. "Brad was just explaining that you two think I should sign my house over to you." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. "Dad, we're worried about you. Really worried. You've been having some problems lately, and we think it might be time to consider some help." The words sounded rehearsed, like lines she had been made to memorize. But underneath the practiced delivery, I could hear genuine distress in her voice. Whatever Brad had told her, she believed it was true. "What kind of problems?" I asked gently. Sarah glanced at Brad, who nodded encouragingly. "Well, last month when we had dinner at our house, you seemed really confused afterward. You couldn't remember where you parked your car, and you asked me the same questions 3 or 4 times. I remembered that evening clearly. After eating Sarah's pot roast and mashed potatoes, I had indeed felt disoriented and foggy. I had struggled to remember simple things, and had felt almost drugged. At the time, I assumed I was coming down with something. And the week before that," Sarah continued, gaining momentum, "you called me at 2 in the morning asking what day it was. You sounded completely lost. That call had never happened. I was certain of it. I had been in the habit of going to bed at 10:30 and waking at 6:15 every day for decades. I had never called anyone at 2 in the morning in my life." "Sarah," I said carefully, "I need you to think very hard about this. When exactly did I call you at 2 in the morning?" She looked confused for a moment, then glanced at Brad again. It was a Tuesday night." "No, Wednesday." Brad took the phone because I was too upset to talk. "I see," I said. "And Brad told you I was confused and asking about the day?" "Yes," Sarah said, though she seemed less certain now. I leaned forward slightly. "Sweetheart, do you remember the actual conversation, my exact words? Or are you remembering what Brad told you?" I said. Sarah's face went pale as the distinction hit her. I I didn't actually talk to you. Brad said you were too confused to have a coherent conversation. Brad jumped in quickly. Denver? This is exactly what Dr. Williams warned us about. You're trying to convince Sarah that your problems don't exist. It's a common defense mechanism. But Sarah wasn't listening to Brad anymore. She was looking at me with growing confusion and concern. Dad, did you really call us that night? No, sweetheart. I did not. I go to bed at 10:30 every night and sleep until 6:15 every morning. I have done so for the past 20 years. Your mother used to joke that she could set her watch by my schedule. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. But Brad said, What else has Brad said? I asked softly. What other incidents have occurred that you didn't actually witness yourself? The question hung in the air like smoke. I could see Sarah's mind working, reviewing the evidence that had brought her to this moment. How much of it had she actually experienced, and how much had been filtered through Brad's interpretation? The grocery store incident, she said slowly. When you supposedly got lost in the frozen food section and couldn't remember why you were there. Which grocery store? I asked. Sarah looked blank. Brad said it was Peterson's Market. I haven't shopped at Peterson's Market in 5 years, I said. Not since they stopped carrying the sugar-free ice cream your mother liked. I shop exclusively at Morrison's now, where I've known the manager for 15 years. I could see doubt creeping across Sarah's features as she began to question the foundation of everything she thought she knew about my recent behavior. Dad, she said hesitantly, if these things didn't happen, then why would Brad? She couldn't finish the sentence. The implications were too horrible to voice aloud. That's when I realized it was time to reveal what I suspected about those family dinners where I had felt so confused and disoriented. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. At those dinners, where I seemed confused afterward, what did I eat and drink? Just normal dinner. Whatever we were having. Did Brad prepare my plate? Bring me drinks. Sarah's face went white as the possibility I was suggesting began to dawn on her. Dad, you can't possibly be suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, I said calmly. I'm simply asking you to consider all possibilities. Brad's composure finally cracked. This is insane, he said, standing up abruptly. You're paranoid, Denver. This is exactly the kind of delusional thinking that proves you need professional help. But his protests were too loud, too aggressive. Even Sarah seemed taken aback by the sudden change in his demeanor. Brad, she said quietly, maybe we should slow down a little. Let Dad process everything. We don't have time to slow down, Brad snapped, his careful mask slipping further. The lawyers are expecting these documents back by Friday. The facility needs confirmation by Monday. Sarah stared at him in shock. What lawyers? What facility? I thought we were just having a family discussion. Brad realized his mistake immediately, but it was too late. He had revealed that this family discussion was actually part of a legal process that was already in motion. You've already made arrangements, Sarah asked, her voice rising. Without talking to me first. I was protecting you, Brad said, trying to recover. You were too emotional about this to think clearly. The condescending tone was the final straw for Sarah. I watched as 26 years of my daughter's independent spirit reasserted itself. Too emotional to think clearly, she repeated, standing up to face him. About my own father. That's when I decided it was time to open the drawer and show them both exactly what I had discovered about Brad, because while he had been busy manipulating my daughter and planning to steal my house, I had been conducting an investigation of my own. And what I had found was far worse than simple greed or manipulation. I reached into the drawer beside my chair and pulled out a thick manila folder that I had been carefully compiling for the past 3 months. The weight of it felt substantial in my hands, representing countless hours of meticulous investigation and documentation. Before we go any further, I said calmly, I think you both need to see what I've discovered about my son-in-law's background and recent activities. Brad's face went ashen as I opened the folder and began spreading its contents across the coffee table. His confident swagger evaporated completely, replaced by the wide-eyed panic of a cornered animal. The first photographs showed Brad meeting with an elderly woman named Margaret Holloway at a coffee shop downtown. Margaret was 83 years old and lived alone in a beautiful colonial house worth approximately $400,000. In the photos, Brad was leaning close to her, pointing to documents very similar to the ones he had just tried to pressure me into signing. Mrs. Holloway signed her house over to Brad 6 months ago, I explained as Sarah picked up the photographs with trembling hands. She now lives in a state-funded nursing facility, and her house has been sold. Brad netted approximately $350,000 from the transaction. Sarah's mouth fell open in shock. That's impossible. Brad doesn't own any property except our apartment. I laid out the next set of documents: bank records, property transfers, and legal filings that told a clear story of systematic fraud. Actually, he does. Or rather, he did. This is the second elderly person's home that Brad has acquired through questionable means. The first was a gentleman named Robert Chen, age 79, whose family still believes their father died of natural causes while living independently. Brad finally found his voice. "This is all lies," he said desperately. "Fabricated evidence. You're having delusions, Denver." But I wasn't finished. The next section of my folder contained what I considered the smoking gun: documentation of Brad's real identity and criminal background. "Your real name isn't Brad Thompson, is it?" I asked, pulling out a driver's license photo and criminal background check. "It's Bradley Thomas Kellerman. You've been using false identification for the past 4 years." Sarah sank back onto the couch, staring at the documentation in disbelief. The man she thought she had married was someone else entirely. "You have prior convictions in Oregon and Nevada for elder abuse, fraud, and identity theft," I continued, reading from the background report. "In Oregon, you convinced an 80-year-old widower to sign over his farm by claiming you were his nephew. In Nevada, you married a lonely elderly woman and drained her retirement accounts before disappearing." The room fell silent except for the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing as she processed the magnitude of Brad's deception. "How did you find all this?" she whispered. "I hired a private investigator," I said simply. "When I started feeling confused and disoriented after our family dinners, I suspected something was wrong. The investigator confirmed my suspicions within 2 weeks. I pulled out the next batch of evidence: photographs of Brad with other families, always in similar situations. An elderly man being pressured to sign documents. An older woman looking confused and frightened as Brad explained something to her adult children. "He targets wealthy, elderly homeowners who have adult children he can manipulate," I explained. "He researches their backgrounds through public records, identifies vulnerability points, and then systematically isolates them from their support systems." Sarah was crying now, tears of anger and betrayal streaming down her cheeks. "So our entire relationship, everything, was carefully planned and executed," I confirmed gently. "He identified you as my only heir approximately 18 months before he approached you at the library. Your work schedule, your interests, your relationship status. He knew all of it before your first conversation." Brad made a sudden move toward the front door, but I held up my hand. "I wouldn't recommend leaving just yet, Bradley. You see, the private investigator wasn't working alone." I pulled out the final section of evidence: federal case files and coordination documents with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. "It turns out that your activities have attracted the attention of federal law enforcement. Elder abuse that crosses state lines becomes a federal crime, and you've been very active across state lines." Brad's face went from pale to green. He sank back onto the couch as if his legs could no longer support him. "The FBI has been building a case against an organized elder abuse ring operating across the western United States," I continued. "Your activities in Oregon and Nevada were already on their radar. When I contacted them about your approach to my family, they were very interested in setting up a controlled operation." Sarah looked at me with amazement and growing pride. "Dad, what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that everything we've discussed here today has been recorded with federal law enforcement listening in real time. Your husband's confession to drugging me, his threats about legal guardianship, his admission to preparing fraudulent medical evidence, all of it is documented and admissible in court." The sound of car doors slamming outside confirmed what I was about to reveal next. "And I'm saying that Bradley Thomas Kellerman is about to be arrested on federal charges of elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Because this isn't just about one criminal targeting individual families. This is about bringing down an entire organization that has been systematically stealing from elderly Americans for years. Through the front window, we could all see the black SUVs pulling up to the curb and federal agents stepping out onto my driveway. The doorbell rang with the authoritative sound that only law enforcement seems to manage. I stood up slowly, my old bones protesting after sitting in that chair through the most intense hour of my life in recent memory. That would be my former colleagues from the Bureau, I said calmly, watching as Brad's face cycled through disbelief, terror, and desperate calculation. Sarah stared at me as if seeing a completely different person. Former colleagues? Dad? What are you talking about? I walked to the front door, feeling more energized and purposeful than I had in the 3 years since my retirement. I spent 32 years as a federal agent, sweetheart. Financial Crimes Division. I specialized in exactly the kind of operation your husband has been running. Through the peephole, I could see Agent Patricia Morrison, my former partner of 15 years, standing on my front porch with 3 other agents I didn't recognize. Behind them, 2 more vehicles had arrived, and I could see agents positioning themselves around the property. Special Agent Morrison, I said warmly as I opened the door. Right on time. Pat smiled, though her expression remained professionally serious. Good to see you, Denver, though I wish it were under better circumstances. She looked past me into the living room where Brad sat frozen in place and Sarah continued staring in shock. Is our subject still inside? Bradley Thomas Kellerman is sitting on my couch, exactly where he's been for the past hour, confessing to federal crimes while wearing a wire, I confirmed. Sarah, my daughter, is also present. She's innocent in all this, just another one of his victims. Pat nodded and gestured to the other agents. Let's take him into custody. As the federal agents entered my living room, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced since my final case before retirement. There's something deeply gratifying about using 3 decades of investigative experience to protect not just yourself, but other potential victims as well. Bradley Thomas Kellerman, Agent Morrison announced, producing her credentials and a warrant. You're under arrest for federal charges, including elder abuse, wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit racketeering, and violation of the RICO Act. Brad finally found his voice as the handcuffs went on. This is entrapment. I was set up. Actually, I said, settling back into my chair. You set yourself up. When you decided to target a retired federal agent who spent his career investigating financial crimes, you made what we call in law enforcement a tactical error. Sarah was looking back and forth between me and the federal agents as if she had stumbled into someone else's life. Dad, I don't understand any of this. You told me you worked in insurance. I had told her that, and I felt a pang of guilt for the deception. But my work with the Bureau had often required protecting my family through misdirection, and old habits died hard. I did work in insurance, in a sense, I explained. I made sure that criminals who preyed on elderly Americans got properly insured against freedom for very long periods of time. Agent Morrison was reading Brad his rights, but she paused to address Sarah directly. Miss Kellerman? Or do you prefer Miss Denver? It's Sarah Denver, my daughter said quickly, and I had no idea about any of this. I thought my father was having memory problems. I thought. We understand, Agent Morrison said kindly. You're a victim here too. These predators are very sophisticated in how they manipulate family members. Well, need your statement, but you're not under any suspicion. As Brad was being led toward the front door, I stood up one more time. Bradley, I called out, causing him to turn back toward me. You made one critical mistake in your research about me. He glared at me with undisguised hatred. What's that? You found out I was a widower with a house worth $700,000 and an adult daughter who could be manipulated. But you didn't dig deep enough to learn that I specialized in exactly your type of crime. If you had known I spent 15 years working elder abuse cases, you would have moved on to an easier target. Brad's expression shifted from hatred to something approaching grudging respect. You played me from the beginning. No, I corrected. I protected my family and other families from a predator. That's what I was trained to do. And apparently retirement doesn't change those instincts. After Brad was secured in one of the federal vehicles, Agent Morrison returned to speak with Sarah and me privately. Denver, I have to say, this operation was textbook perfect, she said. The recording equipment you wore picked up everything we needed. His confession to drugging you alone will put him away for 10 years minimum. How many families has he targeted? Sarah asked, her voice small and hurt. Agent Morrison consulted her notes. Based on what we've uncovered so far, at least 8 elderly victims across 4 states, total financial damages in excess of $2.4 million. But your father's operation gave us something even more valuable. She pulled out her own folder of evidence. Kellerman led us to the larger organization. His handler, a woman named Patricia Sanchez, runs a network of at least 12 people operating similar scams across the western United States. We arrested her and 4 associates this morning in coordinated raids. I felt a familiar rush of professional satisfaction. How many total victims? Preliminary estimate is over 200 families affected, with total damages exceeding $15 million. This is the largest elder abuse bust in the Bureau's history. Sarah was shaking her head in amazement. Dad, how long have you known? I started getting suspicious about 6 weeks after he started dating you. I admitted. Some things about his background didn't add up. When I started feeling confused after family dinners, I knew someone was drugging me. After that, it was just a matter of building a federal case. Why didn't you tell me? I reached over and took her hand, because I needed him to believe his plan was working. If you had known the truth, you couldn't have played your part convincingly. And because I needed to protect you from the emotional trauma until I could prove what was really happening. Agent Morrison nodded approvingly. Your father's experience with undercover operations made this whole thing possible. He knew exactly how to make Kellerman feel safe and overconfident. There's one more thing, I said, turning to Sarah. The property and money Kellerman stole from his previous victims, most of it is recoverable. The federal government has seized his assets, and there's a victim compensation fund being established. What about the families who trusted him? Sarah asked. How do they get their homes back? Agent Morrison smiled. That's the beautiful part of your father's operation. Because we caught Kellerman before he could complete the transfer of your father's property, we were able to freeze all his assets before he could liquidate them. Mrs. Holloway will get her house back. Mr. Chen's family will receive the proceeds from their father's property. Justice doesn't always work out that cleanly, but in this case, it did. As the federal vehicles pulled away from my house, I put my arm around my daughter's shoulders. She was still processing everything that had happened, but I could see the relief beginning to replace the shock and betrayal. Dad, she said quietly, I'm so sorry I doubted you. I'm so sorry I almost. You have nothing to apologize for, I said firmly. He was a professional manipulator who spent months earning your trust and affection. What happened to you could happen to anyone. But even as I comforted my daughter, I knew our ordeal wasn't quite over, because Agent Morrison had mentioned something that suggested Brad's crimes were even more extensive and dangerous than simple fraud, and I suspected that before this case was closed, we would discover just how much more sinister his plans had been. 3 weeks later, I sat in a federal courthouse downtown, waiting to testify before a grand jury. The case against Bradley Kellerman and his criminal organization had grown far beyond what any of us had initially imagined. Agent Morrison had called me that morning with news that would shake our community to its core. Denver, she had said, we need you to review some additional evidence that came to light during our investigation of Kellerman's associates. Now, sitting in the witness room adjacent to the grand jury chamber, I was looking at documents that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy my investigation had helped uncover. The door opened and Agent Morrison entered, followed by Assistant U.S. Attorney James Park, who was prosecuting the case. Behind them came someone I hadn't expected to see. Detective Lisa Rodriguez, from our local sheriff's department. Mr. Denver, Attorney Park began. What we're about to share with you is going to be difficult to hear, but it's crucial for understanding the full extent of this criminal enterprise. Detective Rodriguez opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick file. We've been investigating what appeared to be natural deaths among elderly residents in our county over the past 18 months. 3 individuals who were living independently when they died suddenly of apparent heart attacks. I felt a chill as she continued. All 3 had recently been approached by individuals we now know were part of Kellerman's organization. All 3 had refused to sign over their properties. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You're saying they were murdered? We're saying the pattern is suspicious enough to warrant reopening these cases as potential homicides. Attorney Park confirmed. Kellerman's laptop contained detailed files on all three victims, including photographs of their homes, financial information, and notes about their resistance to the organization's pressure tactics. Agent Morrison pulled out crime scene photos and autopsy reports. Robert Chen, Margaret Holloway's neighbor, died 6 months ago of what appeared to be a heart attack, but the medical examiner found traces of digitalis in his system, a heart medication that can be lethal in large doses. Eleanor Whitman, age 78, died 3 months ago. Detective Rodriguez continued. Also an apparent heart attack. Also traces of digitalis that weren't initially flagged because she had been prescribed the medication in small doses for a legitimate heart condition. And Frank Morrison, no relation to Agent Morrison here, Attorney Park added, died just 6 weeks ago. Same circumstances, same toxicology findings. I stared at the evidence in horror. They were killing people who wouldn't cooperate. It appears that way, Agent Morrison confirmed. Kellerman's files also contained detailed research about you, including your daily routines, your medical history, and notes about elimination options if psychological pressure and legal manipulation failed. The room seemed to spin as the full extent of how close I had come to being murdered sank in. If I hadn't been a retired federal agent, if I hadn't recognized the manipulation tactics, if I hadn't been able to build a case that led to his arrest. There's more, Detective Rodriguez said grimly. We found similar files on 12 other elderly homeowners in the county. Kellerman's organization was planning a massive operation targeting anyone with significant property assets who lived alone. Attorney Park leaned forward. Your investigation didn't just stop a fraud scheme, Mr. Denver. It prevented what could have been the largest serial murder operation targeting elderly Americans in modern history. Sarah, who had been sitting quietly beside me throughout this briefing, finally spoke up. How many people are we talking about? How many potential victims? Agent Morrison consulted her notes. Based on the files we've recovered and the testimony from arrested organization members, we estimate they were targeting approximately 150 elderly homeowners across 4 states, total potential property value exceeding $50 million. My God, I whispered. And if people refused to cooperate, they would have been eliminated. Attorney Park confirmed bluntly. We've identified similar suspicious deaths in Oregon, Nevada, and Arizona that we're now investigating as potential homicides. Detective Rodriguez pulled out one final document that made my blood run cold. It was a floor plan of my house, with detailed notes about entry points, security systems, and what appeared to be a timeline for a staged break-in. This was found in Kellerman's apartment, she explained. It's dated just 5 days after his confrontation with you. If our operation hadn't succeeded, he was prepared to eliminate you and make it look like a home invasion gone wrong. Sarah grabbed my hand, her face pale with shock. Dad, they were planning to kill you. They were planning to kill a lot of people, I said grimly. Elderly Americans whose only crime was owning property that criminals wanted to steal. Attorney Park gathered the documents as we prepared to enter the grand jury chamber. Mr. Denver, your testimony today isn't just about fraud charges anymore. We're seeking indictments for conspiracy to commit murder, multiple homicides, and what we're calling organized criminal enterprise targeting elderly Americans. As we walked toward the grand jury room, Agent Morrison pulled me aside. Denver, I want you to know that your decision to investigate instead of just calling for help saved more lives than we may ever be able to count. This organization was growing, getting more sophisticated, and becoming more willing to use violence. How long do you think they would have continued? I asked. Based on their financial projections and target lists, we estimate they were planning to operate for at least 5 more years. At the rate they were accelerating, we could have been looking at hundreds of deaths. The grand jury testimony lasted 4 hours. I walked them through every detail of my investigation, from my initial suspicions through the recorded confrontation in my living room. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment before the foreman thanked me for my service to the community. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, Sarah and I were approached by a reporter from the local newspaper. Mr. Denver, she said, do you have any comment on the role you played in exposing this criminal organization? I thought for a moment before answering. I was just a father, protecting his family and his community, but this case should serve as a warning to everyone. Elder abuse is real. It's sophisticated, and it's growing. Families need to stay close, stay involved, and trust their instincts when something doesn't feel right. As we walked to our car, Sarah asked me something that had clearly been weighing on her mind. Dad, how do you live with knowing that people died because of these criminals? How do you process that level of evil? I stopped walking and turned to face my daughter. You focus on the people you saved, I said simply. You focus on the fact that justice was served, and you make sure that everyone learns from what happened so it can't happen again. But even as I said those words, I knew that the hardest part of this whole experience was still to come, because soon, Sarah would have to face the full truth about her relationship with Bradley Kellerman, including discoveries that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her own life. 2 months after Bradley Kellerman's arrest, Sarah came to my house carrying a banker's box filled with documents she had found while cleaning out the apartment she had shared with him. Her face was pale and drawn, and I could tell from her expression that she had discovered something devastating. Dad, she said, setting the box down on my kitchen table with trembling hands. I found some things that I think you need to see. She pulled out a folder labeled Sarah Denver, Background and Assets in Brad's handwriting. Inside were detailed financial records, copies of my property deed, Sarah's employment records, and photographs that had clearly been taken without her knowledge. He was researching me before we even met, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Some of these photos are from 2 years ago, months before he approached me at the library. But that wasn't the worst of it. The next folder contained legal documents that made my blood run cold. A marriage certificate showing Bradley Thomas Kellerman, married to a woman named Patricia Vance in Portland, Oregon, dated just 6 months before his wedding to Sarah. He was already married, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. Our entire marriage was fake. I was never actually his wife. I reached across the table and took her hand, feeling rage and protective fury surge through me. But there was more, and I could see from Sarah's expression that the worst was yet to come. She pulled out a notebook filled with Brad's handwriting, page after page of detailed plans and observations. As I read, I realized we were looking at the methodical notes of a psychopath who had planned every aspect of his infiltration of our family. Phase 1. Establish relationship with target daughter. I read aloud. Create emotional dependency through love bombing and isolation techniques. Timeline, 6 to 8 months. Sarah's hands shook as she turned to the next page. Phase 2. Undermine father's credibility through systematic confusion and disorientation. Drug administration during family meals. Create documentation of mental decline. Timeline, 3 to 4 months. Phase 3. Legal pressure and family intervention. Convince daughter that guardianship necessary. Transfer property assets. Timeline, 1 to 2 months. I flipped to the final page and felt my heart stop. Phase 4. Eliminate primary target. Stage accident or home invasion after property transfer complete. Maintain relationship with daughter for appearance of grief support. Sarah was sobbing now, the full impact of how close we had both come to murder, hitting her with devastating force. He was going to kill you, Dad. After he got the house, he was going to kill you and comfort me through my grief. But there was still one more folder in the box, and when Sarah opened it, we discovered the most sickening aspect of Brad's plan. Inside were detailed psychological profiles and manipulation techniques specifically designed to control grieving women. Post-elimination protocol. I read from his notes. Subject will be emotionally vulnerable following father's death. Maintain supportive presence while systematically isolating from remaining support system. Timeline for financial asset transfer. 12 to 18 months. He hadn't just planned to murder me. He had planned to spend the next year manipulating my grief-stricken daughter into signing over her inheritance, her life insurance payout, and anything else of value I might have left her. Sarah, I said gently, you need to understand something. Nothing that happened between you two was real. None of it. Every conversation, every gesture, every moment of apparent affection was calculated manipulation designed to position you as a tool in his criminal enterprise. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. How did I not see it? How was I so stupid? You weren't stupid, I said firmly. You were targeted by a professional predator who spent months studying exactly how to exploit your personality and vulnerabilities. This could have happened to anyone. But Sarah's self-blame was overwhelming. I almost helped him steal your house. I almost helped him have you committed. I believed every lie he told me about you. And when you realized the truth, you immediately stood with your family. I reminded her. That's what matters. Agent Morrison arrived an hour later to collect the additional evidence Sarah had discovered. As she reviewed Brad's notes, her expression grew increasingly grim. This is some of the most detailed predatory planning I've ever seen in 20 years with the Bureau, she said. These notes are going to be crucial in prosecuting the other members of his organization. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now Bradley Kellerman faces additional charges of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. Agent Morrison replied. Combined with his other charges, he's looking at life in prison without the possibility of parole. And what about the other victims' families? I asked. The people who weren't as lucky as we were. Agent Morrison's expression softened. Mrs. Chen's family will finally know what really happened to their father. Mrs. Whitman's son will learn that his mother didn't die of natural causes. Mr. Morrison's daughter will understand that her father was murdered. It won't bring them back, but their families will have closure and justice. Over the following weeks, Sarah began working with a counselor who specialized in helping victims of sophisticated psychological manipulation. It was a slow process, but gradually she began to forgive herself for falling victim to Brad's carefully crafted deception. The counselor says that recognizing manipulation after the fact is actually a sign of psychological health. Sarah told me one evening as we sat on my back porch watching the sunset. She says people who never fall for any manipulation are often too cynical to form healthy relationships. Your mother would be proud of how strong you've become through all this, I said, and proud that you've chosen to help other families avoid what we went through, because that was exactly what Sarah had decided to do. Using the speaking and communication skills she had developed in her library work, she had begun giving presentations to senior citizen groups and family organizations about recognizing and preventing elder abuse. I can't undo what happened to me, she had told the first group she addressed. But I can make sure that other daughters recognize the warning signs before it's too late. As federal prosecutors prepared for Bradley Kellerman's trial, they asked Sarah to participate in victim impact statements. It would mean facing her abuser in court and publicly describing the psychological damage his manipulation had caused. I want to do it, she told me. Not for revenge, but so the judge understands the full scope of what these criminals do to families. The financial crimes are obvious, but the psychological destruction is just as real. The trial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. Bradley Kellerman had refused all plea bargain offers, apparently believing he could convince a jury that he was the real victim of entrapment by a former federal agent. He was about to learn just how wrong he could be about that. The federal courthouse was packed on the morning of Bradley Kellerman's sentencing hearing. After a 3-week trial that had captivated national media attention, the jury had taken just 4 hours to convict him on all 37 counts, including fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy to commit murder, and racketeering charges. I sat in the front row with Sarah, watching as the man who had nearly destroyed our family was led into the courtroom in shackles. The confident manipulator who had sat in my living room demanding I sign over my house was gone, replaced by someone who looked broken and defeated. Judge Margaret Patterson had presided over the trial with remarkable patience and attention to detail. Now, as she prepared to announce Kellerman's sentence, the courtroom fell completely silent. Mr. Kellerman, Judge Patterson began, in my 32 years on the federal bench, I have rarely seen crimes as calculated, as cruel, and as devastating as those you have committed. You systematically targeted the most vulnerable members of our society, exploiting their trust and stealing not just their property, but their sense of safety and dignity. She paused, consulting her notes. The evidence presented during this trial reveals a level of psychological manipulation and callous disregard for human life that represents the very worst of criminal behavior. You didn't just steal money and property. You destroyed families, murdered innocent people, and caused immeasurable suffering across multiple communities. Sarah squeezed my hand as the judge continued. The victims in this case range in age from 68 to 91. They were grandparents, war veterans, retired teachers, and community volunteers. They had spent their lives contributing to society, only to be targeted for destruction by your criminal organization in their most vulnerable years. Judge Patterson looked directly at Kellerman before announcing his sentence. Taking into account the severity and scope of your crimes, your lack of remorse, and the need to protect society from further predation, this court sentences you to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel came down with finality, and I felt a deep sense of justice and closure wash over me. Sarah burst into tears, not of sadness but of relief that this nightmare was finally over. As Kellerman was led away, he turned back toward our section of the courtroom. For just a moment, his eyes met mine, and I saw something that might have been regret, but it was too little and far too late. After the sentencing, Agent Morrison approached Sarah and me in the courthouse hallway. "Denver, I wanted you to know that the task force has officially adopted your investigation techniques as training protocol for undercover operations targeting elder abuse. Your case is literally being taught at Quantico now." "What about the other organization members?" Sarah asked. "Convicted across the board," Agent Morrison replied with satisfaction. "Patricia Sanchez got 25 years. Her associates received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. The judge in Oregon called it the most comprehensive elder abuse prosecution in federal history. But the true measure of our victory wasn't found in the courtroom. Over the past 6 months, Sarah and I had been working together to establish something that would have a lasting impact on protecting other families. Using the financial restitution recovered from Kellerman's criminal enterprise, we had founded the Sarah Denver Foundation for Elder Protection. Our mission was simple: educate families about the warning signs of elder abuse and provide resources for elderly Americans to protect themselves from predators. "Dad," Sarah said as we drove home from the courthouse, "I've been thinking about what you said the day all this started, about how sometimes the greatest victory is not just surviving betrayal, but transforming it into protection for others." "What about it?" "I think Mom would be proud of what we've built together. The foundation has helped 17 families avoid scams in just 6 months. That's 17 elderly people who are still in their own homes because of what we learned from our experience." She was right. My wife Helen would have been proud. She always believed that difficult experiences were only meaningful if you used them to help others avoid similar pain. The foundation had grown beyond anything we initially imagined. Sarah had left her library job to work full-time on elder protection advocacy. She traveled throughout the region speaking to families, training law enforcement agencies, and working with federal prosecutors to strengthen laws protecting elderly Americans. "I have some news," Sarah said as we pulled into my driveway. "The Department of Justice wants the foundation to go national. They're offering federal funding to establish offices in 10 major cities." I felt a surge of pride in my daughter's transformation from victim to advocate. "What did you tell them?" "I told them yes, on one condition: that you agree to serve as the Foundation's chief investigative consultant." At 72 years old, I thought my career in law enforcement was over. But apparently, there was still work to be done, still families to protect, still justice to serve. "I accept," I said without hesitation, "on one condition of my own." "What's that?" "That we name our first training program the Helen Denver Memorial Elder Protection Initiative. Your mother always said the best way to honor someone's memory is to prevent others from experiencing unnecessary pain." 6 months later, Sarah and I stood together in our new foundation office in Washington, D.C., looking at a wall covered with thank you letters from families who had avoided elder abuse scams because of our educational programs. "You know what the most important lesson is in all of this?" Sarah asked as she hung up the latest letter from a grateful family in Michigan. "What's that?" "That love and family bonds are stronger than any manipulation. Brad could forge documents, drug people, and create elaborate lies, but he couldn't destroy what we built together over 26 years. When it really mattered, when the truth came out, we stood together." She was absolutely right. Trust, once broken, can be rebuilt. Families, once damaged, can heal stronger than before. And sometimes, the worst experiences in life become the foundation for the most meaningful work you'll ever do. Today, the Sarah Denver Foundation for Elder Protection has helped prevent over 300 cases of elder abuse across 12 states. We've trained law enforcement agencies, educated thousands of families, and worked with federal legislators to strengthen laws protecting elderly Americans. But more than that, We've proven that sometimes the answer to betrayal isn't revenge or bitterness. Sometimes the answer is transformation, service, and a commitment to protecting others from the same pain you've experienced. Bradley Kellerman is serving life in prison, and his criminal organization has been completely dismantled. Justice was served, families were protected, and the vulnerable members of our society are a little bit safer because of the lessons we learned from our experience. And that, I believe, is what my wife Helen would have called a life well lived, taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and using it to make sure it never happens to anyone else. In closing, I want to ask you something. Have you noticed any sudden changes in an elderly family member's behavior or decision-making? Have you seen signs of isolation, confusion, or pressure from new people in their lives? The warning signs of elder abuse are often subtle, but they're there if you know what to look for. Please take a moment to like this story if it opened your eyes to the reality of elder abuse in America. Subscribe to hear more stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges and finding the strength to fight back. Share this with your family and friends, because the elderly people in your life need you to be aware and involved in their protection. And please leave a comment sharing your own experiences or thoughts about how we can better protect our elderly family members from predators. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to recognize a dangerous situation in their own family. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that it's never too late to fight back, it's never too late to seek justice, and it's never too late to transform your pain into protection for others. Stay close to your family, trust your instincts, and remember that sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when the people they love are threatened.